Welcome, everybody, to the first workshop for Map the System Canada in 2024. Map the System Canada is sponsored by ACCO and in its partnership with the Institute for Community Prosperity and the School Centre. My name is Ashley Dion, and I am the program lead for Map the System Canada. Map the System Canada is housed at Mount Royal University, which is located on the traditional territories of the Blackfoot Confederacy, which includes the Siksika, Kainai, Piikani, Tsuut'ina, and the Stoney Nakoda nations. It is also home to the Métis Nation of Alberta. To find out what territory you are in, I will post a website for you to look at it. Feel free, if you'd like, to put your own territories that you're in into the chat. Today's workshop is to learn about what you can get out of participating in the competition. And our guests today are Karen, Brandon, and Jenna, all three of which were global finalists in the 2023 Map the System competition. So join me in thanking Karen, Brandon, and Jenna for being here today. Let's get started. Karen, I'm going to hand it over to you. So if you can just kind of introduce yourself and talk about why you decided to participate in the competition and what topic you decided to talk about.
Yeah, so my name's Karen Fletcher. I'm from Athabasca University, and I was the president of our student union, and we were on Parliament Hill advocating for students. And one of my colleagues looked at me and was like, there's this thing called Map the System, and you would love it. And I was like, oh. And so we looked it up, and I was like, I would love it. Unfortunately, the timeline for AU to register had passed, and she's like, I'm going to make them. And I was like, I don't think that's how the world works, Trish, but Trish is a force of nature, and she and the team found a way. So I was just kind of encouraged into it from there. And I looked at the barriers to student success in post-secondary, because one of the things I found as a student advocate is that deans and administrators had a tendency to be like, well, why do students drop out? And it sounds like students just give up, but really, like, speaking with students, there are so many barriers that students encounter both in the academy and the rest of their life. Like, some of them, they're needing to work to support a family, or there's a crisis, or the other parts of their life. And those also impact student success. So I was really excited to map out kind of the relationship between different parts of students' lives and their success. So we could examine, where are their leverage points where we can improve student success by looking at the whole picture, and not just kind of a paradigm that says if students are leaving school, that's because they don't care. Because I found that wasn't true, and that often students who were leaving school did deeply care about their education. They just had run up against barriers that they needed help overcoming.
Amazing, thank you. And I'll pass it over to Brandon next.
So hi, everyone. My name is Brandon. I'm from the University of Calgary. I am a student and researcher in the School of Medicine. And so I'm studying precision health. And where I kind of got exposed to Map the System was actually from another program that I was doing at the University of Calgary. And when I heard about Map the System, I was really intrigued because it allows you to really look at relationships between different things and think of things more as a whole and more siloed. And so in my experience in research, we really like to think about things very specifically and more narrow focused. And so this would allow me to think a little bit bigger and take that step back. And so the problem that I worked with, so I also had team members that were passionate about this, and we joined forces to look at the family physician shortage in Canada. And then as we kind of went globally, we took even a further step back to think about things, the situation with shortage of family physicians in different parts of the world as well. So I joined it because I was passionate about healthcare. I really wanted to gain another skill set to think a little bit more bigger and look at bigger relationships. And then, it's a problem that affects me as well, looking for family physicians, and then my team members as well, where, one is a family physician resident and then a pharmacist. So that's really why I joined Map the System, and that was our problem.
Amazing. Over to you, Jenna.
Thanks, Ashley. Hi, everyone. My name is Jenna. Really excited to meet you all today. I'm currently a fourth year student at the University of British Columbia. I'm studying integrated sciences, so neuroscience, public health, and physiology. And how I got exposed to math system was a bit different because we actually had a professor talk about the competition in a class. So I was taking like a systems for sustainability class. And so that was a really great program class at UBC that offered students a time to kind of learn about sustainable solutions and really get exposed to kind of systems thinking. And so we did a group project. And so my teammates, Gabby and Rihanna, we all decided to talk about sexual health education. And so we actually started learning about that from looking at the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And yeah, I think we were just really kind of inspired by like our research and the topic about how important sexual health education is not only for women, but for all kind of students to learn that they have a right to this education and how crucial it is for them to kind of have that self-determination and kind of autonomy over themselves and their bodies and to be educated about like their sexual health and reproductive well-being. And so we kind of did our project about that. And then our teacher kind of was talking about math system as this opportunity. And so we kind of decided to enter because we were really passionate about our project and we kind of wanted to see how much further we could take it. And I think we were keen to kind of have the opportunity to kind of conduct some of that primary research and take our project further. And so, yeah, again, that's how we kind of got exposed to kind of the competition. And it was really a great opportunity to really use that kind of interdisciplinary thinking that we don't really get too much to do in terms of our coursework, I think, especially as like a science student. And so, yeah, I think it really kind of gave us like a new skill set. So, yeah.
Thanks, Jenna. So next we'll move on to, we'll just do the same order of who's speaking. Just kind of what you got out of the competition, both professionally and personally. You know, was it worth it all the time? We all know that it's quite a bit of time to put into this competition. And then also, how do you use systems thinking now?
So absolutely worth it. It was such a good experience. So what did I get out of the competition personally and professionally? Professionally, it was really useful to immediately be able to bring a lot of the information I was researching as for my project, which I think we've had a few new people join. My project looked at post-secondary success and barriers, and I was the president of the student union, into meetings I was having with university administrators. So to be able to show up and be like, okay, president or provost or whoever you are, I know you're looking at students not succeeding at this course, but let's look at why they're not succeeding. Like you're worried that, you know, they don't have enough time invested in their assignments. Like, let's talk about why that might be. Let's talk about how we can come up with assignments that work with what students are. So we are assessing what they've learned, but that they're approachable. And it was interesting to be able to immediately be able to talk to the people in my life about the stuff I was researching. That was really useful. Because I was working in the area that I did my project on. And that's one of the neat things about Map the System. If there's a situation in your life that you're already involved in, whether it's professionally or academically or a volunteer thing, you can do the project on something that's in your life. And I found that that was really helpful and really helped me because I already had familiarity with the landscape, as it were. Professionally, I got to meet people and we also were given quite a bit of training. We had a number of workshops like this over kind of January, February, March, where we delved into skills that we could use. So that training was really nice. And then if you're a finalist, if you're one of the Canadian finalists, you get to go to Oxford. And I didn't realize, I didn't do this on purpose, but this is my Oxford mug. I got to go. It was really exciting. And they had workshops on visual communication, on how do we make systems change. So just that like hands-on teaching was something that I found really exciting. I go to Athabasca University, which is an online university. And when I picked AU, I had mixed feelings about it. On one hand, I was really, really thankful to have the opportunity to go to university. I have 3 kids and I couldn't afford both daycare and tuition. And so AU was accessible when other brick and mortar institutions weren't. And I was sad that I wouldn't have those classroom experiences. So for me to get to go and sit in a classroom with students from all over the world is one of the highlights of my degree and something that I'm so thankful for. That was really cool. That might be more cool if you're from AU because you've done your entire degree sitting in front of your computer by yourself. So I really loved that. I did my project on my own, but then I got to interact with other students throughout parts of the competition, and I loved that. It absolutely was worth it. Do I use systems thinking now? I'm going to soon. Right now I'm finishing my degree. I'm a math student. So right now I kind of have my head down in the midst of something called partial differential equations, which is mostly about physics, but I'm applying to master's programs. And what I really want to do is do data science and look at data science and how we can make equitable decisions with data. And so actually earlier today, I had a meeting with a potential supervisor and we were able to talk about some systems thinking about how data can be used equitably and how we use that. So I have plans to use systems thinking, but at the moment I need to finish these courses. Yeah, that's me.
Awesome. Thanks, Karen. I love that using data for systems thinking. I think it's a really cool approach, and I think it's great that maybe the competition kind of led you there. Brandon, go ahead.
So hi, everyone. Yeah, so if some of you have just joined, my name is Brandon from the University of Calgary. So I'll start off, was it worth it? Like, absolutely. And I'll tell you why. So personally, the problem that I worked on in my team was on the shortage of family physicians in Canada. And so my background is a lot in research, in healthcare, medicine, that kind of thing. And it's something that I'm really passionate about. I came from bringing more of a patient perspective to things and research. My other team members from a family physician perspective, and then a resident, and then a pharmacist. And so really that collaborative effort was one of the really things that I fostered, that I really felt was really strong. And personally, just to get those different perspectives and think about the problem first, rather than just jumping right to a solution. I think that was really impactful for me personally, as well as meeting other students in different areas. I think that's really valuable. Just from a general curiosity point of view, where learning about sexual health education from Jenna, as well as how do we break down those barriers for student success in post-secondary, with Karen, even to climate change and agriculture, totally diverse perspectives. Really interesting to learn about the different problems, not only in Canada, but also internationally. So I think that was really valuable. Now professionally, so the first thing was, with my background in research, a lot of things we think about are very narrow focused and trying to really answer a specific research question. But this really provided me a new way of thinking, to think about relationships and things as wholes, which I think really translated very well professionally. So if you're writing grants, for example, you can really advocate for the impact that certain things have. And then also the ability to present and pitch ideas and advocate for, your change or your problem that you're passionate about. Really, you can think about it day to day, where we're always making some sort of a business case or some sort of, challenge that we really are advocating for. And I think that's really helped with that. And I think it translates, at least to me personally, in other aspects of life, as well as professionally in research. And yeah, I think it just helped me to be a better communicator, just in everyday life. So how do I use it now? So as I kind of mentioned with grant writing, I think it really has helped me become a better researcher, to think a little bit more about how things are related, not so much specifically in grant writing, in really having that powerful change and demonstrating the impact. And then also, having the ability to have access, if you're fortunate to be a Canadian finalist, you have access to the Apprenticing with a Problem grant, and having that opportunity to have some funding for something that you're passionate about, I think is really impactful. So those are some ways that I use it now, and really encourage you to ask more questions and get more involved. So.
Yeah, I'll just reintroduce myself again for those of you just joined. I'm Jenna, and I'm from the University of British Columbia. So yeah, I think coming to the first question about was it worth it, I think, I totally can echo the sentiments of Brandon and Karen. I think that the Matheson competition was 100% worth it. I think it was definitely something that's going to be like a highlight of my undergraduate experience. I think not only for the opportunity to get to go to Oxford, but I think also just for the entire process of from kind of ideation and starting our kind of project to really see kind of your entire project come together, come through, and the opportunities and kind of the people you get to meet along the way. I think personally, like getting to kind of like work in a team, we really became great friends, and everyone having their own kind of perspective and having that chance to kind of collaborate was really, really helpful. I also think just the connections that we got to make. I think at the national finals, getting to like meet with teams from across the country and kind of hear their perspectives and hear different topics. I think map system is great because it's so broad in terms of the wide range of social and environmental issues you can cover. And so we really learned a lot from other finalists. And same thing kind of like at Oxford, having the opportunity to connect with people from across the world, and really kind of you really kind of saw similarities. I know we had discussions with students from the United States about healthcare, specifically about like, nursing and kind of the physician shortage that Brandon was mentioning, and also similarities in terms of like facing barriers to education, kind of similar to what Karen's product was about. So it was really great to kind of see like similarities and kind of, but also learn so much from the connections that we made from across the world. Um, I think professionally, it was really helpful to kind of gain a lot of those skills in terms of research, conducting primary research, having the opportunity to kind of do interviews, was a really great skill that we learned. And also just systems thinking as a whole, being able to kind of break down a problem and look at it on a more like holistic level. I think for me as a student was really helpful. Definitely something that like we had learned kind of for the first time. And I think as a science student, I was used to kind of just 4 years of multiple choice kind of exams. And so it was very kind of like there's a right answer, there's a wrong answer, and like that's it. Like you kind of just learn to like memorize, or maybe you learn to kind of look at an issue, but it's very much from like a science perspective. And so I think the way map system really encouraged you to kind of look at government, to look at external stakeholders, to look at policy interventions, to look at grassroots organizations who are kind of solving your problem. It really was helpful to kind of learn to think about problems in a more holistic way. And I think for me, kind of personally, it's been really helpful in my own research. Like I'm specifically involved in substance use and kind of opioid use disorder research. And so I think, typically kind of people think about that from like, you can think about it from like a biological perspective, or just kind of looking at like the changes in the brain that happens when you use opioids. But I think map system really kind of encouraged me to kind of look at it from a more systemic level and really look at what are the determinants, or what are the mental models, like why is there stigma. I really kind of encourage you to kind of take a broader approach. And so for me personally, that's been really kind of helpful from like a researcher perspective to kind of bring that perspective and share that with like our teams. And I think also, as Brandon was mentioning, through like the AWP grant, like as a Canadian finalist, we're kind of really honored to be the recipient of that and have the opportunity to kind of take our work further. And so our team's having the chance to kind of work with the national nonprofit about menstrual health equity. And so we're really excited about the opportunity to kind of collaborate with them and have the opportunity to kind of do more research and really work on kind of more of like the knowledge translation side about making this research accessible and also inclusive.
Amazing. Our next kind of question can go to any of you, so whoever has an answer is welcome to jump in. It's just, what advice would you give someone starting their map the system journey? Does it look like if you were to start today, would you do things slightly different maybe? So if anyone has an answer to that, Brandon, Jenna, Karen, feel free to jump in.
I think don't be afraid to explore. Like there was a lot of kind of rough notes and maybe I'll go this direction, maybe I won't. And don't jump to feeling like you need to start working on a finished project, but really sit with the exploratory, let's think about what this system looks like. There was a long document Map the System Canada sent out last year that was kind of like how to approach it. And I found that really helpful. And going to the sessions were also really helpful because I learned a lot and I learned about different approaches that I wouldn't have normally thought about. I have a tendency to kind of be like, let's zone in on a solution, and Map the System helped me step back. And so just to allow yourself to step back and not think about it as I need to check off these items so I can be done and have my submission in, but really to sit with it and research and also ask for feedback. I had the absolute privilege to get together with deans from a couple different universities, some in Canada, some elsewhere, and talk about their system and explore some systems that are parallel but different. So if you're looking at healthcare, maybe if you know any Americans with relevant experience, be like, okay, well, how's it different in America? What solutions do you have that we don't? Because I think that really helped, especially at the final levels, to be able to be like, what other countries have done that is working that could be applied here, was something that I found really helpful to have in my back pocket.
Yeah, I definitely agree with what Karen said. I think she did a great job. I think those are all very important. One of the things I think she touched on was, just to reiterate, is really focusing on that problem, because a lot of things, a lot of times you want to jump right to the solution, and that's okay, but really, when you understand the problem deeper and all the relationships, then it helps better inform the solution that you want to talk about. Because really this is system mapping, and you really want to understand that before you kind of jump right into things. The second thing I think is try to find something you're passionate about. You know, you want to, you know, you're really diving deep into something, so you want to make sure that it's something that you actually find interesting, not necessarily something that, you know, you're doing just because. So I think that's something that's really important. It is, you know, somewhat, it does involve some time, and you know, you want to make sure you enjoy some of that along the way. I think those two were really important. And then yeah, the third thing, you know, really, if you have some mentors at your own institutions, Map the System Canada as well is really great, and really take advantage of the resources that they provide, you know, asking those open-ended questions, and, you know, try to have fun with the process too. I think it's a really good, you know, experiential learning with a little bit of, you know, core components as well. So.
Yeah, I think totally agree with Karen and Brandon. I think maybe just one more thing to kind of like add in, or that our team found especially, was don't be afraid to kind of like cold email or to kind of like ask for help. I think one thing that we found that was really helpful, or where we kind of generated a lot of really helpful insights from, was speaking firsthand to like sexual health educators, speaking to kind of professors. So I think really don't be afraid to kind of put yourself and your team out there, and you'll find that people are really willing to kind of share share their knowledge and kind of share their interviews, share their advice with you. And so we really found that kind of doing interviews or doing surveys, finding ways to kind of get that primary research is something that we found specifically to be like super helpful, in addition to kind of more traditional kind of forms of research or literature review kind of styles. So yeah, I think, and also finding something that you're really passionate about. I think because you are working on this project for so long and you're so interested in the system, it makes it a lot easier to kind of do the project when you're really keen about understanding the system, understanding the relationships about it. And I think you'll surprise yourself with how much you're able to kind of map out through your research once you're kind of in the middle of the project.
I had something to add. I just thought of. You'll be using a website called Kumu to make your systems map. Two things. One, spend some time, like give yourself an afternoon to play around with making like bad maps and figuring out how things go, because it's less frustrating to be like, I'm not making my map right now, I'm just learning, than to try to learn while you make your map. Also, Kumu has the option to clone a map. So if you're like, I'm going to try something new on my map, but I'm happy with where it is, cloning it and experimenting on the clone. So if it doesn't go well and you don't like it, you have like a save point, is something that helped my mental health during the competition, because there were some experiments for me that ended badly with that software. But because I cloned it and was like, I'm happy with it now, I could go back and I'd have that as a backup, which that was an excellent decision on my part, and one I would encourage you to copy.
That is great for all of that advice from all of you. Speaking of Kumu, we actually do have a workshop coming up at kind of the end of February. More information will come out later, but on Kumu, because we know that it can be a bit of a challenge to use and figure out. Kind of based off that, I am kind of curious, did you find, because there's many system maps and there's many ways to do a systems map, did you find one in particular more helpful for you understanding the problem? Did you do more than one? And, you know, if you did more than one, maybe they laid over each other, and that's how it made more sense to you, that you were like, oh, I did a timeline map and I did a stakeholder map, and then this problem actually made more sense to me. So if any of you could maybe speak on that, that'd be great.
Yeah, sure. I can get us started. I think the first map I think that we made that was really helpful for us was the kind of iceberg model map, where you kind of look at like what kind of problem do you see, and then below the iceberg, kind of what are the kind of like levels to this problem. And so I think for our like problem especially, was like really helpful. So for example, our like outcome was that, you know, students aren't able to kind of have sexual health knowledge. And so we know that from kind of research and from surveys that students in BC are really kind of like lacking this important knowledge. And then when we kind of looked at it from like an iceberg perspective, you really kind of started to look at more of the systematic and kind of like barriers that really kind of go in towards creating those outcomes. So whether it be a kind of other example of that was like we see that, you know, there's a lack of teacher training. And then when we kind of look at that further, maybe there's also just in general a huge like stigma and kind of like lack of comfort with like the topic and kind of nervousness about how to teach it. But then that really kind of stems from like the stigma of how sexual health is kind of discussed. And so I think starting with like an iceberg model really helped us kind of map out our system, because from there we kind of expanded into looking into stakeholders and to kind of looking in like maps of like who are the different influencers that influence how a student is learning about sexual health. And so I think iceberg model, at least our group found it was a good way to kind of start in terms of helping us know some of the challenges and kind of look at it on the levels of like a mental model, on levels of what are the kind of policy level or kind of like system level things that happen across government, across schools that kind of enable this. And then also kind of, I guess the outcomes were the first ones that we found, and that really kind of sparked our kind of need to really address this kind of system and address the challenge. So I think for us, the iceberg model was the most helpful for being our starting point.
I did 2 maps. The first one was all the different parts of the system. And I started out just being like, I'm going to make nodes and then I'm going to draw connections and label the connections. Because at first I didn't have a really good sense of how everything was connected. And so it didn't look pretty. It was very much a work in progress. But the nice thing about Kumo is you can say, have a circle here and a circle here and an arrow. And then if you move one of the circles, the arrow stays connected. And so I could play around and Kumo actually can be like, hey, there's a loop. And if you're struggling to find loops because your map has so many nodes because it's a bit of it, like there's a lot going on, it will help you find loops and say, hey, there's a subsystem here. The other one I did was I did a power map. So I had one about the student experience and how, you know, a student's housing insecurity can lead to them working more, to which can lead to have less time to study, which means their grades drop, like that kind of student experience side. And then I had a power one, like who can change the system, to be like, well, in Alberta, you have the Minister of Education and you have the university's Board of Governors, and students are over here on the side and they have really not a lot of power to impact certain areas. And that was really helpful in explaining the system to people in Oxford, because of course everyone's from different, well, not everyone's from different countries, but most people are from different countries there. And people from Nepal or England or Argentina aren't going to immediately know how the different parts of the Canadian post-secondary education system work together. And so I found that map really helpful, just to be like, we're going to just spend 1 minute and you're going to understand because there's a picture.
Yeah, I think that those are some really good points. You know, we also did use the iceberg model, you know, similar to Jenna, as like a starting point. You know, it allowed us to see, you know, what's on the surface, what do we see, and then allowed us to go a little bit deeper. And then, you know, having that understanding of the stakeholder map, just to reiterate as well, I think really did help inform that system mapping. One other like map that I really loved, just to bring up, is the impact gap canvas, it's called. So that just from an understanding of like, so basically the impact gap, there's on one side, there is the challenges, and then on the other side, there is the solutions. And so there's a gap then in between there, and understanding, you know, what's the problem, what's the solution, and where is the missing link. I just thought, just, you know, kind of on a side point, I really love that. It really helped to communicate and better visualize like what's missing. Yeah, one thing to kind of mention too.
Thank you for that. Actually, the impact gaps canvas is what Map the System was kind of based out of. So it is a great one to kind of look at as well when you're going through the competition, and it has some great guiding questions to think about as well. I do see we have a question in the comments. If there are any additional questions, feel free to ask in the comments or even to unmute. So the question is, any additional text anyone found to be useful?
Trying to think from my perspective, I mean, we did do a lot of research and interviews. I just know that like the Map the System book, that like text that they have, the PDF, was like, you know, kind of our Bible in following what we needed to do. In terms of like the specific problem, you know, we did look at like primary research and that sort of thing, specific to that. You know, I think hopefully that's helpful. I definitely think the Map the System book was something that we relied a lot on.
I popped the link in the chat, I think. But yeah, I just worked my way through that. And it's nice because it's all offline, like you can download it. And then if you're, say, on an airplane for a very long flight, you can make work progress on your flight. I did a lot of my project in airports because that's where I spent my life last year.
Yeah, what is the time commitment? How much time did you spend on your Map the System project? We often tell students here at Map the System Canada that we're like, spend about 80 hours on your project and you should be in pretty good shape, but I'm curious to see what your answer is.
I kept being like, things are busy right now, but Map the System ends in April. And then I was like, actually, because I went to Canadian semifinals, Map the System ends in May. And then I was like, because of finals, Map the System ends in July. Now I'm like, because of apprenticing with the problem, Map the System ends in June. So it's expanded for me. For the actual like project to get to the institution level, like the first copy I handed in, I probably would say like 40 or 50, but I was working in a sphere where I had a lot of relevant research already compiled. Like that made it a lot more efficient. And again, I had some long, boring flights and like airport times where I was able to be like, I don't have anywhere else to be. I'm stuck in the Montreal airport for 5 hours. So I kind of made use of dead time in my life. And then between when I was selected to represent AU and the Canadian semifinal, I probably spent about 10 hours revising and rejigging things. And then between the Canadian final and Oxford, I probably spent an additional 10 to 15 hours. And then I was in Oxford, for a week, which was great.
Yeah, I think for our group specifically, I think managing Map System along with like a full course load and extracurriculars was definitely like a challenge. I think we definitely knew we were committed to the project, and so I think especially for the first kind of UBC deadline was right before finals, so it was like a big push to kind of get it done. I think definitely kind of agree with Ashley saying that definitely around like 80 hours kind of for our first kind of like draft. I think there also is like a lot of time that you'll kind of find spent just like editing your diagrams or like reviewing like your scripts. And, there is also like an oral presentation. So we definitely spent a lot of time practicing that, coming up with our script, coming up with our slides. How do we kind of make our 10-minute presentation like engaging? That was kind of a lot of time as well that went beyond just like the map and the report. And also, I guess a lot of the time spent like contacting interviewers and kind of lots of, I guess, admin kind of tasks that kind of came along with the project as well that maybe we didn't factor in too much for. So I think, yeah, definitely like, I think well above kind of like 80 for our first submission. And then, yeah, similar to Karen, we definitely spent, I think, quite a lot of time in between the UBC and the nationals, as well as between like nationals and Oxford. I think the great thing about participating in the national finals was that we really got a lot of like feedback. And so it was really helpful for us to kind of go back to like our mentors and also take a better look at our project and kind of see what are some strengths that we could improve on and other weaknesses, then things that we can like fix up and really polish up before the next kind of round. So I think you'll find that you'll kind of do your project and then you'll always kind of be like, oh, I really want to fix this, or I realize that this is like a strength, or now after doing a bit more research, you want to add in like another map. So I think that was kind of what we found, that we were kind of always adding in more research, adding in more maps, and still always kind of working on it. So yeah, I think definitely like, upwards of kind of 150 would probably be at least just like for the project components, but it was definitely well worth it. And we definitely learned a lot through the entire research experience. And so I think all aspects of it were definitely like helpful and kind of necessary, especially.
Yeah, it's hard to specify. I think the most amount of time really is just getting things going. You get your first drafts of everything. That's kind of the big curve that you have to get over, but it certainly is a very iterative process. You're going to get tons of feedback. Be open to feedback as well. And I think for us, like, what took a lot of time at the beginning, and something I would recommend, is really try to like specify the problem. For us, it was like, we're looking at the lack of family physicians. Are we looking at lack of access? Because that's a different kind of problem, like in terms of rurally, like accessing them, or are we looking more of like a supply kind of issue? So we spent a lot of time just really trying to focus on specify that problem. So we did end up doing some work and then we went back. So one thing I would do differently is trying to really make sure you're 100% on that and then work from there before you kind of jump into things too quickly. And then also, having some sort of time management, I think is really important. I would recommend. That's one thing I would do differently as well. Attending some of those education sessions, I think does help. It does take some time, but then you learn how to do things a little bit more efficiently. So that's also kind of another thing I would recommend.
So I'm just gonna go back to, there was a question somewhere, I lost it. All right, what is the most challenging stage of the projects?
For me, it was going from I have all this research to how do I make it into a cohesive map, and is my map too broad or too narrow? As an individual, I tend to want projects to encompass everything, and I was the only person in my group. I was the solo submission, and so that's something that I would find challenging in any project, and something I do find challenging in any project. I liked working on my own because as someone with 3 kids and who was working full time, finding time that works with other people is actually very difficult. And when you're the only person in your project, you can be like, how am I going to change my presentation in your shower? Right? Like you can be walking through the grocery store and running through like, well, how am I going to change things? And I think actually working with other people would have made it less accessible for me, because I'm getting schedules to line up with my kind of unusual living situation, and some other commitments I had would have been very, very difficult. I think it was different work. I don't think it was more work. I think probably the amount of time I saved on when do we need to meet, or what do you think, or I think this, and back and forth, kind of was offset by the fact that I was doing everything myself. I don't know that, I wouldn't say I did less work than Brandon or Jenna, but I also don't think I did more. I think probably it was pretty equal. But yeah, narrowing the project down was the hardest thing for me.
Yeah, I think Karen really touched on that point. Trying to find that time to meet and dedicate that time, and doing so proactively, I think was challenging for sure. Just in general, I think in any group setting, everyone has different schedules, especially if you have clinical schedules. So really trying to meet those times together. So one thing, I'd suggest is just trying to do so proactively. And there are some components that you can work separately and then come together after when you can do that. So I think that was challenging. A second thing, I think it depends on what kind of person you are as well. Like you are, going out of your comfort zone in some aspect too. So, if it's public speaking, if it is trying to think, if you're someone who really likes paying attention to details, trying to go out of that comfort zone and, go outside what you're used to, and think bigger, and vice versa. If you do think too big, then maybe you need to focus a little bit more. So just being aware of maybe your personality type, and trying to adjust that, I think is something to keep in mind.
Yeah, I think I definitely kind of agree with kind of Brandon's point about trying to find times to kind of work as a group. I know for our group especially, we did lots and lots of like very long kind of like Zoom sessions, because that way we could just kind of work like in very kind of late hours into the night, but we were all together. So I think being proactive about finding tasks that you can kind of split up, and being really open to feedback from your group members. I think we were able to kind of put everything together, and then also be kind of constantly editing and iterating our versions based off of like all of our own opinions on what we thought were our strengths and what thought things that we could fix. I think for us specifically, a big challenge was just kind of like getting started. I think sometimes when you see the kind of finalized maps or the kind of finalized projects, it does look like really intimidating. And so I think sometimes just taking that first step or trying to write like our instruction was like, that took us like so long, because it was so hard to kind of be like, how do we even start writing? So I think maybe like or at least maybe from our perspective, the biggest advice was just to kind of get started. I think just do like a first draft, or have some kind of like really detailed outline, even if it's not perfect. Because you'll kind of constantly find that you're always like working on your project and implementing feedback and kind of making a different version. So I definitely think that just starting and having kind of your big first draft, or just starting like, let's just look at the challenges like just right now, was probably like the best kind of decision. So yeah.
Amazing. Well, I'm just going to go over to the hand that is raised so we don't lose it. Race, go ahead if you have a question.
Hi. So I already have like a project group, but we're really having like trouble narrowing our scope. So like, do you have any like advice on how to narrow that scope and how to like control yourself from like going too broad and like really narrowing your aspect and like focusing on our topic?
I would get a really big piece of paper and make an ugly map. Like, don't try to make it pretty, but like draw everything out and then go, are there subsystems that we could break off that to focus on? Or is it all one together? Mine was pretty broad, but I was like, everything is connected. There's not something that can be neatly removed. But I think that that can give you perspective at seeing how things are related, because sometimes we look at something and we're like, actually, those are a couple different systems and they absolutely do impact each other, but it's easier to focus if you do just break off a chunk. But having that, like, something worth doing is worth doing badly if it gets you started, is something I found really helpful. Like, I'm someone that wants everything to be perfect right away, and being like, it's on paper, it's going to be ugly, I don't care, this is an experiment, and giving yourself permission to have a bad first draft if it helps you get going is something that helps me in any project.
Yeah, I think that that's a great suggestion, and something that we did is we just got feedback from our mentors, and initially we said, okay, we're gonna look at the lack of access to family physicians, and she was like, what do you mean by access? Like, do you mean access in terms of like transportation or supply and that kind of thing? So I think having another perspective, if you do have that ability, I think is helpful to get another opinion, maybe outside the group. And then coming back and then kind of focusing on that. And then just trying to think like what scope overlaps with the most systems versus one that's like a few different systems. Maybe thinking that way as well might be helpful.
Yeah, for sure. I definitely kind of agree with like, Karen and Brandon's suggestions. I think one thing that kind of we found, and that also kind of we found that a lot of the other kind of national finalists or international groups was like narrowing it down by like location. And I think maybe that's like one kind of place to start, is just like how big do you want your kind of scope to be? And if you can narrow it down by state or by country or by like area, is probably like the biggest. Or kind of, I think at first glance might be the most easiest way to kind of narrow down your scope. I also think that depending on your topic and depending on your system, you might find that there are certain stakeholders that like definitely need to be kind of included, or other kind of systems you want to look in more specifically. So definitely think that we found from our interviews, like doing a really big kind of stakeholder map and just thinking about everyone who's involved in your system can also help you kind of like narrow down your scope. So I know for our project, for example, we wanted to look at specifically like education, but in like the elementary and kind of secondary school system. So we're not looking at it from like a university level, because we thought that when you talk about sexual health education in schools, it's really kind of delivered in the K-12 system. So you might find that when you're doing your research, there's kind of like a stakeholder that really kind of emerges, or other stakeholders that you find are less relevant. So you can also narrow down your scope that way.
That was great. Yeah, oftentimes when we talk about it, we're looking at like boundaries is what we normally call it in system mapping. What are your boundaries? And that can be geographical, could be an age category. So like could be a generation, could be a specific age, like elementary or something like that. And that kind of helps to define. And then also often thinking about it as well, who's your audience? Who is going to read your research? What kind of knowledge will they have? And that sometimes can help you narrow down to not be like, oh, I need to include the entire world, because maybe the entire world's not going to read it. So that's also another great way to kind of pare down some of that. We have another question. Well, we have quite a few questions, but going back up to where we were, what's the first few steps if you were to start today? So what would you start with?
I would click that link in the chat, the map the systems thing, and I would just read through it, and then I would start working through it, because it has worksheets. Like, it has, let's define a problem. And I found that really helpful because I didn't have a mentor or anything. Like, the student union convinced AU to register, and they were like, the student union is asking us to do something and it's easy to say yes, so we will. So that was the level of support that I had from AU. It's AU's second year. If you're here, don't be scared. I think that they're ramping up a little bit more this year. But that document was where I'd get started. It was so helpful, and it's something I came back to over and over.
Yeah, really echo the same thing. Maybe if you're still trying to struggle on finding that problem, there's those worksheets. Also like looking in the news, thinking about what you're passionate about, seeing if there's anything to grab onto there, I think might be kind of a secondary thing. But.
Yeah, I think for ours, it kind of emerged out of like a class assignment, kind of looking at UN Sustainable Development Goals. So I think maybe think back to any kind of research paper or any kind of like maybe assignment that you had that really sparked your interest that you really enjoyed researching, and that could be like a good starting point. I think we also were really inspired looking at some of the other kind of examples from national kind of finalists, and you kind of realize like looking at those that just like there's really such a broad kind of array of social and environmental issues. And so really that can, sometimes that looking at those examples really kind of gave us some inspiration about where we wanted to take our project.
The other thing that I will say, at least for all of the Canadian students on the call, is you're always welcome to email me, and I'm happy to sit down and chat through anything if you're confused or anything like that. So you've always got help from Map the System Canada as well. Our next question is, do you have set time to complete the different stages of the project, and how are you reducing biases in the project?
I think for our group, sorry, Karen. I think for our group, it was a little harder to have somewhat of a set time, but something I probably would recommend, just, every Tuesday at this time you meet, and you have that in the books. So you have dedicated time to discuss. And then in terms of reducing biases, I think that's a really good point. For us, we were lucky because we had different perspectives, but still within the same sphere. And I think, doing the primary research through interviews and surveys was one way that we could help validate kind of what we're thinking. And then, getting that different perspective from, other people, such as mentors, I think was one way that was helpful.
Okay, there wasn't a set timeline. Like you don't have to have your map in on one day, your presentation on another. There will be a deadline and you'll submit everything. It would be a very good idea to make yourself your own little deadline so you don't, have a difficult time at the end. And I would definitely like try to have everything done a week before so you can have some time to be like edit and tweak. In terms of reducing bias, I would say look at your sources. Like, are all of your sources academic? Well, if they are there people who aren't represented in the academy whose experiences might be missed? How could you talk to them and like where would they be? And so I would look at like who you're getting your information from. And if there's one group that's not in that list, especially if it's a relevant group, to talk to them. And one of the other groups at Globals looked at women's access to IVF in, was it Nepal? I don't remember. It was a country in Southeast Asia. And it was interesting because I think they spent quite a time doing interviews, because I think, if I remember correctly, there wasn't a lot of published literature about these women's personal experiences. So they went and found that elsewhere. But if they had only relied on academic sources, they would have missed that. And I think that was something that entry was really strong about.
Yeah, I think just adding on to that, I think for our group, because all three of us were like students with kind of different like school and work schedules, we did try to do like a set time, and tried to like, but also be flexible about, midterms come up or other assignments come up, but we tried to kind of really have a set time to work on it, every week, and also kind of just block off like full days to kind of just talk about it on Zoom or meet up in person and kind of go over the project. We thought that was really helpful. We also did set like kind of a mini timeline for ourselves, which we thought was also helpful. I think, as Karen was saying, it is a big deadline. You hand in everything at once, but I think having kind of like mini deadlines for ourselves, and also kind of going to feedback, like from our mentors, like from Map System Canada, from the Map System team at UBC was really helpful. And yeah, in terms of reducing biases, I think one way that we found was really helpful was kind of through our survey. So really kind of asking students about like their personal experiences, doing like a really wide reaching survey was helpful, and also doing a lot of kind of interviews with different kind of stakeholders in the system. So we kind of talked with like an academic professor who kind of brought her own kind of perspectives about what kind of needed to be changed in the system. Also kind of doing interviews with sexual health educators to see kind of what they think about when they're in different schools, when they're in schools kind of maybe in more Vancouver, when they're in schools in kind of rural areas. So I think finding kind of those like interviews is really helpful for us to see how we can reduce bias, and also kind of look at like the different kind of like news sources that you're kind of like looking at. I think you'll kind of find that there's a different kind of tonality when you're speaking about a topic that may be like stigmatized. And so recognizing the bias in your sources, or where you can kind of try to find, like just because you'll find a bunch of different sources that may each one have a different bias. And so it's really kind of up to you as a researcher to really kind of synthesize that and put that together and be able to kind of draw your conclusions. So we thought that was really helpful.
Yeah, and I'll just add on to that as well, just with map the system is we're looking at you want well-rounded kind of research, right? So even like a blog, social media is all counted as credible in map the system. So you're looking for just things that, I think can eliminate some of those bias, because it's not just, oh, only this group ever publishes work. You can get information from other sources as well. Next question. So this is about stakeholders. Did you have, I think what this question is asking is there a different way that you differentiated stakeholders from each other, that you weren't just like, oh, they're just government? Like, how do you?
Can I clarify that one?
Yeah, for sure.
Sorry, so sometimes like you have, for my research, you have stairs for walking pedestrians and stairs for rolling pedestrians, and they mean very different things, but they have the same label. So like, did you guys bump into that sort of thing, and if you did, how did you handle it?
So in Canada, when we talk about changes we make to something, make it more accessible, in university we call those accommodations, and all of the literature calls them accommodations. And I was talking to a British person and they were like, Karen, what are you talking about? Because accommodations exclusively refers to student housing in the US or UK. And so what I did is I put a big footnote and I said, in Canada, accommodations refers to this. The British equivalent is, I don't remember, but there was a word that they would use. And so I had that in my document, in my map, and in my presentation. I was like, you might use the word this in Canada. We mean that. And just so we were all on the same page. And then I assumed everyone was clever enough to follow as I used the Canadian term. And it worked out fine.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. It's something at a local final, even Canadian final, maybe the terminology is similar, but certainly when you go internationally, that's something we had to think of. Like we call the emergency room the emergency room, but in the UK it's the A&E, and but you can kind of like define the problem based on those boundaries that you set. For the stakeholder map, we organized it, just kind of based on how we wanted to structure it. But then you can add those nuances in just to clarify for the other readers. Yeah.
Perfect. Paul, you had another question. Did you just want to ask that since you're on camera anyways?
Is there a specific flavor of systems mapping? Like for database stuff, we use a particular type of systems mapping, but this is not database stuff. So I guess the UN uses soft systems modeling, and there's like some other flavors. But is it just like a hybrid, whatever works kind of thing, or is there a specific kind of like a theme? I guess I don't know what you call that.
I think from our group's perspective, we kind of had a lot of kind of examples of like systems like mapping and kind of systems thinking. I think there's like lots of ways to kind of approach systems mapping. So I think it really kind of depends on your like your problem and your kind of like your project and like the kind of scope of it and really what aspects of it you want to map out. I think map system definitely kind of encourages like you to be creative and to kind of map the system in a way that makes the most sense for the viewers to understand, like will be easy to understand, and also what is accurate to kind of like the research. So for example, I don't know if you have like a power kind of dynamic map and there's only like, two people in power, then maybe your map really only consists of those two like two players. So I think it kind of really depends on like the scope of kind of your project. I know like for our group, for example, we kind of found that we had like our stakeholder map was really complex because there's like lots and lots of stakeholders who were involved in the student experience. But then when it came down to like our root causes map, we really kind of narrowed it down and just looked at like 5. So those were kind of the 5 main kind of pillars kind of on our map that we really chose to identify. So I think there's really lots of different ways to kind of do it. I know our group used like Canva and kind of definitely spent like hours and hours like rearranging our kind of diagrams in there. So I think there's definitely like lots of different ways to kind of map your system. And I think just as long as it's like kind of accurately reflects the problem, and you'll find that as you kind of go through and like do your research, you really are customizing your maps as to what makes the most sense for your project and for the kind of research that you want to convey.
I think for our group, like personally, I didn't have a lot of experience in system mapping going into it. And so I really just relied on the resources and the workshops to really help me make that decision. So using a lot of the recommended maps and that kind of thing, that's kind of how we navigated that based on our problem. Yeah.
Amazing. Yeah, we don't have a specific map that you have to use through Map System Canada. I often say use multiple maps because it helps you just to understand the problem a little bit better. Your classic, what we'd classically call a systems map, is more like the, what is it, the 5Rs model, I think it's called. But there is no requirement of a specific type of map. So you can kind of do what makes the most sense to, yeah, explain your problem. I mean, I say also Map the System is also a bit of a communications competition in the fact that you need to be able to effectively communicate what is happening in a very complex system in a short amount of words, a visual and a presentation. So that's something else to just be aware of, like, how do we make this make sense to other people? And that's why, again, it's great to take whatever you have and show it to somebody else and be like, is there any parts in this that you get lost or you're confused? Because that's an important part of the competition as well, is that you want to make sure your judges understand what you're trying to say and understand the research that you have done. Okay, we're going to do one last question that's in the chat here. And I will probably just answer this one. Is ethics approval required for undertaking research within Map the System? It is not required, but I will say do not interview like vulnerable populations. So anyone that you are interviewing, organizations, like you want to look at people that have, you know, credible, are considered like credible experts in that area. You're able to interview them. So just be a little bit cautious. Your institution might have specific requirements. It is very institution specific of what they have for ethics on the competition. But we don't require you to obtain ethics because often it takes a very long time and you don't have time to obtain ethics before the competition. But do try to make sure that all your sources are from like a credible source as well. Or again, just putting it in there of like, this was obtained from social media. This is what people are saying on social media. You know, you can't 100% sure check that it's, you know, correct, but it's just great to be able to kind of put that in there and, you know, have that understanding. I don't know if there is anything that Jenna, Karen, Brandon, that you want to add on to ethics, but I'm assuming not. I'm assuming that mainly comes from us. Yeah, perfect. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. I'm just going to drop the link in case anyone hasn't registered for Map the System Canada. I'm going to drop it into the chat. Definitely register. And thank you so much to Karen, Jenna, and Brandon for joining us today. We'll stay on for a few minutes if there are any last minute questions as well.